Well, no longer could I attend Berean Memorial Church Sunday School because as I grew and went to seminary, my participation led to so much hostility. I was so excited about learning things like commentaries. I didn't know commentaries existed that were available for the average Christian to go look at. I used two commentaries, Bible Knowledge Commentary from Dallas Seminary and Expositor's Bible Commentary from various groups of people together. Both were very, very valuable and still are valuable. But I still have to discern what I think is biblical and what isn't, and that's up to me to decide. And it's not so hard because when you practice reading and you see, this must be an addition or that's wrong by what means? By language, context, and logic, the normative rules of those three things, language, context, and logic, and you can decide what it says. I like expositors because it offers a number of different points of view and gives you the choice to make up whether or not you want to choose one point of view or another. So no longer could I attend Berean Memorial Church Sunday School because my participation did lead to so much hostility. The teachers were especially hostile and cut me off in mid-sentence or ignored me in class when I raised my hand to participate. Charlie Newman told me several times that the Sunday school class was very shallow and mostly read out of a weak commentary. He was very, very supportive, and I thank him for that. He wanted me to attend to provide more depth, and so he's encouraged me to participate, but he stood in the back and didn't support me, but I don't know what he would do. I would occasionally attend, but the same old negative reaction would rear its ugly head every time I participated. The new teacher and his family became openly hostile to me whenever I tried to dialogue with them. I used to email everyone about this subject or that from the Bible, and I was studying in order to receive input. The teacher's son told me to stop doing that. They only wanted to hear from Dr. Danish about Bible doctrine. Others in the congregation told me to stop emailing them too in an unfriendly way, thus closing the door on fellowship with many in the congregation completely. I stopped going to Sunday school and training union, which is the evening classes. So I used to go to church, Sunday school in the morning, and training union in the evening. Very, very enlightening. I was uncomfortable sitting in the congregation with so many hostile people around me. A lot of times I would go there and sit in a pew, and nobody would occupy the pew. I attended Dr. D's sermons religiously, but sat by myself in the balcony to avoid contact with those who were offended by my existence. Perhaps it was better. At least they would not be hindered in absorbing what Dr. Danish taught. It was so ironic because Dr. D and others were so supportive, always so supportive of my studies in evangelism, and they encouraged me to go to seminary and were good listeners, but the majority were not. It's interesting that when I first started going there, everyone made me feel like a second-class Christian because of how little Bible doctrine I knew. Everyone was telling me stuff that was in the Bible and pointing to the tape room to study up before I spoke up. That was good advice, but they didn't do it politely. So I took their wise advice. The more knowledgeable I became, however, the more standoffish many in that congregation became. They all often used their knowledge rather than to support one another, to then share their faith with others, but to lord it over others. Every time I made an attempt to participate in church activities, I got the cold shoulder. I longed for fellowship and even desired to help out at the summer camps. But from the very beginning, I found myself standing alone every time I showed up for a Berean event, from that very first church picnic. This is ongoing from the beginning. I remember standing there, and nobody would allow me to eat with them at their tables. Pastor Danish's son, John Jr., often approached me to help out at the summer camp with swimming lessons, because I was a good swimmer. I taught in the Navy, and I went to college, swam there in competition, and was a swimming coach in the summertime in high school. But I didn't dare go in there and find myself ostracized in the Oklahoma wilderness for 2 weeks. I took it as a sign that by and large God was pushing me out the door to be a witness to the world. If they didn't want to hear it, then I should go elsewhere. So much of my witnessing occurred in the workplace, on the bus, in stores, and in various churches, which I visited in the area instead of going to Berean Sunday School. When I was going to the church service, but I wouldn't go to Sunday school, I figured, well, why be ostracized? A couple of people spoke out and said, don't come back. Personally, why would they say that? Interesting that the Bible says what others meant for evil, God turns into good. Most of the time the visits were short-lived, but I always got the gospel message out, and even some other doctrines aired out. The rejection was high and often abusive toward me, but it was my job. Spiritual combat is not supposed to be a tea party. Jimmy Shanks. By the way, in all of this, Dr. Danish was supportive. In one of my encounters on the bus, I met Jimmy Shanks. We dialogued, and he quickly changed from challenging statements to penetrating questions to the questions of a child might pose to his mother about so many things. Every answer amazed him. His eyes lit up as things began to make sense to him. The Bible isn't a mass of confusion, I said, if you approach it logically in the order it was written. After all, I said, it is a book, written material. Most already have the reading skills to understand what it is saying. The trouble is, most pastors and teachers don't teach it like this. Dr. Danish did. They make it out to be a mystical book that only they have the answers to. Their appeal is emotional and for funds. Rarely is it properly instructive. If you read each book in the order it was written in, following normative rules or normal rules of language, context, and logic, you won't find it all that difficult. You have to be honest and take the time to do this. Questions will come up, and it's a good idea, I told them, to find someone you trust to dialogue with you, and perhaps a church that teaches it right. Sad to say, there are only a very few out there who can and are willing to do this. Very few churches. I was able to impart Jimmy with large amounts of true Bible doctrines over the next few years. In part 2. We were friends from the beginning. A major hindrance in maturing in the faith, however, was his addiction to cocaine and times in prison. These had deleterious effects on his progress. The cocaine took its toll on his memory, but he took profuse notes and reread studies I prepared for him. He plotted through his relapses and incarcerations. I sent him innumerable tapes and studies from Berean Memorial Church and spent hours on the phone with him, wherever he was, in constant review with new instructions. I learned patience. He didn't. Finally, he ended up in a halfway house in Treasure Island, Florida, near St. Petersburg. His new living conditions sounded like a vacation brochure across the street from the Gulf. He was so enthusiastic, and I was so glad he was on track. He started an auto detail business and was witnessing every day. At his halfway house, he was teaching everyone Bible doctrine. This is what he reported to me. So Jimmy was my point man. Doors at Berean had already been slammed shut. Texas offered dwindling opportunities to witness or teach. I had visited most congregations within my reach. There were unlimited opportunities by comparison in the St. Petersburg area. The beaches weren't too bad either, Jimmy said. Well, chapter 18, let's go to Florida. So I packed up 12 boxes of essentials, clothes, PC, theological books, toothbrush, and sent them UPS to Florida. I put myself on a $39 Greyhound special that dribbled its way through the South to St. Petersburg. I spent hours trying different sleeping positions that would relieve the agony of cramped legs and back. I stretched my legs out across the aisle onto an empty seat out of desperation and claustrophobia. My backslide would slam onto the floor every time I dozed off. At the end of the trip, the back of the bus emptied out, and I was able to get some relief by stretching out on the last row. I discovered that I really needed my sleep. Never again. Next time I'll fly or walk, which is what I did. Not much better, though. Greater Grace Church. Jimmy had joined the Greater Grace Church in St. Petersburg and made arrangements to have my belongings sent to one of their halfway houses on 62nd Avenue, where I could stay for a while. So I'm going to go into a halfway house. Daniel met me at the bus stop and took me there. His welcome was warm until we started to talk theology. He was testing me out. Why do Christians test each other out instead of share their faith with one another and encourage one another? It's who's top dog. It's awful. He didn't like my focus on teaching the Bible in the order that it was written. He said that the advantage to instruction verse by verse, chapter by chapter, book by book, was that you didn't have to depend upon, I said this, depend upon someone else to do your thinking for you. He favored emotional motivation and topical teaching. I observed to myself that he kept the teacher in control of the student, which seemed to be an issue with him. He appointed himself my teacher, but he didn't realize until quickly that I knew more than he did. Daniel, it turned out, was house mother of my residence. When I arrived, I was greeted by a woman at the door who was also house mother. Trouble in paradise had already begun. She brought me over to a small storage room in the front of the tiny house. It was completely filled with junk and totally filthy. By the way, it didn't have any insulation. It was just the outer wall. There was no inner walls. This room was my living quarters for $75 a week for I don't know how long. It was hot and stuffy and had a pungent, moldy odor. The reason why I had a pungent, moldy odor because it was moldy. It took all day to clear out the room. House mother number 2 did not enable me to help much. She threw out almost everything and jabbered nervously as I made repeated attempts to help her. I stacked my boxes everywhere and had to operate out of my suitcase with so little space to move around in this closet. I get a room and a closet, and I paid full boat for a room. The furniture was fragile, and the daybed only supported half my body. The smell of dust and mold was something I never got used to. Matter of fact, I got sick. From the first day on, I had a serious congestion until the day I moved out. Luckily, I didn't have anything long-lasting. House mom number 2 said she had some kind of mental disorder and was supposed to be on medication. She was largely a night person because she said she had difficulty dealing with people. She often had fits of temper and irrationality, which took you by surprise. She hid the few dishes that I took out to use, insisting that I use what she wanted me to use. She was constantly hiding my dishes and food, so I couldn't find anything. I always had to ask her permission to use anything that wasn't mine, sometimes even what was mine. I had to fight for shelf space in the kitchen to store the food I ate. I wasn't allowed to use the dishwasher, that was her domain, nor the phone without special permission. My few dishes were never washed on time by her when it came to time for my meals, so I ignored her edicts about using the dishwasher. We're using there. Fellow Christians, and ran the washer myself in order to get clean dishes to eat my meals in. Amazing what Christians do to one another. Daniel, house mom number 1, threatened to kick me out if I used the dishwasher one more time. There were several others living there also. Robert and a young lady who was recovering from some kind of emotional trauma, and a young man who lived out back in the converted tool shed. In a halfway house. I knew what that was now. He was a Greater Grace proselyte, aspiring to Greater Grace Bible College. He was going to be a pastor there. He kept bringing up what he was being indoctrinated with, similar to Daniel, and habitually reared up like an angry stallion if he sniffed doctrine coming from my lips in response. Shut up and listen. Daniel advised me that unless you were an official Greater Grace ordained pastor, you couldn't instruct anyone in Bible doctrine. I really wasn't instructing, I was just sharing what I knew, which was far more than anybody there. Robert was a Jehovah's Witness hybrid fanatic that came from a physically abusive family. He would challenge me to theological debates all the time and ended up screaming at me violently when I quietly tried to present my case from Scripture. He was sure I was going to hell because I believed, as the Bible said, that you are saved by grace through faith in Jesus, and that alone, not by doing any works. Ironically, that's what Greater Grace taught. No matter how many times I presented Bible passages to Robert that supported my points, he'd end up in irrational fits of anger and condemn me to hell with a string of profanity that would embarrass a sailor. Then several hours later, he'd come up and apologize for his behavior. I wondered if he applied his own theology to himself. Nevertheless, we bonded rapidly, and when I took him to one of my swimming workouts at the Walter Fuller Pool nearby, he was so impressed with my number of laps I swam, and the speed that I swam at, that I became an instant hero. Said he had no heroes in his life, only abuse and mental and physical. So anyone who paid a little warm attention with this young man would receive a similar response in return. But he could not accept the idea that he could go to heaven as a result of a free gift from God without having to do anything to earn it. Just trust in his Son to make that free provision for him. Sad to say, he seemed to be considering what I was showing him a bit more every day, but my stay in this house would be cut short by the fellow Christians. And yet that's what they taught.